Namaskar. In this segment, we will do Purva Paksha of multiple Mahabharata researchers in the context of astronomy observations of Jupiter from the Mahabharata text. Specifically, we will ask the question if these researchers were aware of all these astronomy observations related to Jupiter from the Mahabharata text. If they were aware, how did they interpret those observations? So let's begin with specific Jupiter observations from the Mahabharata text. There are three specific observations of Jupiter in the Mahabharata text. Two of them appear in Bhishma Purva and the remaining one appears in Karna Purva. Let's begin with first observation from Karna Purva, rather the only observation of Jupiter from Karna Purva. The description is immediately after the death of Karna, that is on the 17th day of the war and immediately after sunset. Sakanana sadri chayascha kampu pravi vathur bhuta ganascha marisha Bruhaspati Rohini Samprapidya Babhuva Chandrarka Samanavarna. After the death of Karna and after sun set on the western horizon, the Bruhaspati, that is Jupiter, is described as afflicting Nakshatra Rohini by assuming a color of moon and the sun. The important part to remember is that after the sunset, Jupiter could be seen as afflicting Nakshatra Rohini. There is alternate reading of this same reference and I also present it below. I won't read through it. Instead of Bruhaspati Rohini Samprapidya, it says Bruhaspati Samparivarya Rohini and Babhuva Chandrarka Samo Vishampate. So that is our reference 1. Jupiter afflicting Nakshatra Rohini on the 17th day of the war after the sunset. Let's go to reference number 2. We have seen this before. It's from Bhishma Purva. Senayora Shivam Ghoram Karishyati Mahagraha Maghaswangarako Vakra Shravanecha Bruhaspati. Angarak, that is planet Mars, went Vakri near Nakshatra Magha, and Bruhaspati, that is planet Jupiter, went Vakri near Nakshatra Shravan. That is the meaning of this verse, and this is our reference number 2. Let's go to reference number 3. It also appears in Bhishma Purva, Adhyay 3. And we have also seen this reference before in the context of astronomy references of Saturn. Graho Tamra Runashiko Prajvalanta Vivastito Saptarshiram Udaranam Samavachadya Vaiprabham Samvatsara Sthainaucha Graho Prajvalita Ubho Vishakhayo Samipasto Bruhaspati Shanescharo. This is our reference number 3, which essentially said these two planets, Jupiter and Saturn, were shining brightly and had settled for a year near Nakshatra Vishakha. Let us begin with the discussion of our framework in the context of Jupiter observations. We have 2 axes of evidence and testability and 4 quadrants based on those 2 axes. Now, if one claims to fall in the dharmic superstar and therefore a rational and scientific quadrant, we would expect a Mahabharata researcher to acknowledge all the 3 astronomy observations of Jupiter, and we would also expect this Mahabharata researcher to test all three observations of Jupiter and then note down whether all of them or some of them were corroborated for his or her proposal and theory. If they were not corroborated, we would still expect a documentation of how they tested all these three observations and what was the outcome. For the sake of consistency, we will look at the same set of Mahabharata researchers that we employed in discussing astronomy observations of Saturn from the Mahabharata text, in discussing observations of Jupiter. We will also use the same set of Mahabharata researchers when we discuss astronomy observations of Mars, astronomy observations of Venus, and then astronomy observations of Mercury from the Mahabharata text. The first proposal that we will analyze is by Sri Holay. The first day of the Mahabharata war he proposed was 13 November 3143 BCE. Tithi was Amavasya. Jupiter was near Nakshatra Anuradha and Jeshta. Saturn was near Nakshatra Vishakha. And thus, although Sri Holay did not refer to it, we can consider Jupiter and Saturn to be near Nakshatra Vishakha, and thus a good corroboration for one of the three observations of Jupiter, but also one of the three observations of Saturn. Now, one of the three observations of Jupiter occurred in Karna Purva, and we know the specific timing of it. That is, it was on the 17th day of the war and immediately after the sunset. So we will test for each of these proposals if we could also corroborate position of Jupiter and Rohini in such a fashion that they could also be corroborated by saying that Jupiter could be seen as afflicting Nakshatra Rohini. So for each of the proposal, we will also look at this scenario on the 17th day of the war for their proposed date. Now, interestingly, in this case, we have two dates, either 30 November or 12th December. I don't want to go into too many details, but it's very interesting, so I will mention it. What Sri Holay did is, after the fall of Bhishma, which was on the 10th day of the war, he assumed a break in the war for 12 days. Now, there is no evidence, no references whatsoever in the Mahabharata text anywhere that would justify imagining such a break. In any case, that is what Sri Holay assumed, and if we take that into account, then 12 December is the 17th day of the war, because per his wild speculation, which has no basis in Mahabharata text, the war stopped after the 10th day of the war, after the fall of Bhishma in the battle, for 12 days. Anyways, in either of the cases, after the sunset, Jupiter is already below the horizon, so we cannot visualize why there would be a statement of Jupiter afflicting Rohini for this particular timeline. The second proposal is by Professor Raghavan, originally proposed in 1969. In recent time, Professor Achar has claimed to have tested it, and he also agrees that this is a good proposal. He agrees with Professor Raghavan. The first day of the war is 22nd November 3067 BCE. The first day of the war, Tithi was Shukla 10, that is 4 or 5 days before the full moon day. Jupiter is near Nakshatra Revati and Saturn is near Nakshatra Rohini. Now, keep in mind, Professor Achar had proposed this theory of comets for majority of the observations from the Mahabharata text for planets. So, he considers these Jupiter references as not really referring to the planets, but really referring to comets with name Brihaspati and so on. I have discussed this issue during my discussion of astronomy references of Saturn, so I won't repeat it. But let's go to the 17th day of the war. And in this case, Professor Achar has simply not shown awareness of this reference of Jupiter from Karna Purva, where Jupiter is described as afflicting Rohini. Now, if we try to test this for 8th of December, which would be the 17th day of the war for his timeline, then Jupiter and Rohini both were in the sky. But keep in mind that first thing, Professor Achar is silent on the observation of Jupiter from Karna Purva, and when in another place, that is in Bhishma Purva, when Jupiter reference occurred twice, he has simply explained it away by saying that these references are to the comets, and obviously he has also turned them as non-testable. Next Mahabharata proposal is by Shri V Ketkar. The first day he proposed was that of 8 November 2585 BCE. Tithi was Shukla 14, that is Chaturdashi, that is day before full moon day. Jupiter was near Nakshatra Mula. Saturn was near Nakshatra Chitra and Swati. Now, if you look at their position a bit more accurately, Jupiter was between Jyeshtha and Mula, and in that sense, both Saturn and Jupiter can be considered as equidistant from Nakshatra Vishakha and therefore in the vicinity of Vishakha. Now, again, I did not have access to original work of Shri V Ketkar, so I do not know if he showed awareness of these specific references and if he commented on whether these references corroborated his timeline or not. In any case, we will move on to the 17th day of the war. That would be 24th November for his timeline, and Jupiter was below the horizon. So I cannot see, we will not able to justify Jupiter seen as afflicting Rohini for this 17th day of the war for the timeline proposed by Shri Ketkar. The next proposal is by Professor Sengupta. The first day of the war was 4 November 2449 BCE. Tithi was Shukla 14 Chaturdashi, day before the full moon day. Jupiter was near Nakshatra Kritika. Saturn was near Nakshatra Rohini. And Professor Sengupta avoided interpreting observations of Jupiter either from Bhishma Purva or Karna Purva. He has not shown awareness of Jupiter observation from Karna Purva, and he was aware of two observations of Jupiter from Bhishma Purva, but he simply explained it away by simply stating that they are meaningless, there is so much confusion about them, and it cannot be explained, therefore they must not be true. It's an extremely lame defense that he has offered for his inability to test these observations of planets. Anyways, if we move on to the 17th day of the war, that would amount to 20 November, and we will simply note down that Jupiter and Rohini, they were next to each other and they were in the sky. And remember, Jupiter was near Kritika, and that is next to Nakshatra Rohini. So it is our testing for the 17th day of the war for proposal of Professor Sengupta. But Professor Sengupta himself has shown no awareness whatsoever for this observation of Jupiter. Let's go to the next proposal. It is by Professor Anand Sharan. The first day he proposed was that of 31st October 2156 BCE. Tithi was Shukla 10, that is Shukla Dashmi, 4 or 5 days before the full moon day. Jupiter was near Nakshatra Shravan. Saturn was near Nakshatra Revati Ashwini. And so Jupiter is near Nakshatra Shravan. Now, I have not tested if it went Vakri near Nakshatra Shravan. Professor Anand has not tested in any fashion. I want to mention it because at least it would tend to corroborate one of the three observations of planet Jupiter, where it says Magaswangarako Vakra Shravanecha Brahaspati. And finally, the 17th day of the war, per his timeline, would be 16th November. Again, Professor Anand Sharan has not shown any awareness of this observation. He has not discussed this observation. However, we will simply note down that Jupiter and Rohini, they both were in the sky and were at the opposite end of the horizon. So using the definition that number of Mahabharata researchers have employed, one may be able to say that Jupiter can be described as afflicting Nakshatra Rohini on the 17th day of the war. Next one is by Professor Mohan Gupta. The first day of the war is 17 October 1952 BCE. The tithi is that of Amavasya. Jupiter is near Nakshatra Revati. Saturn is near Nakshatra Purva Bhadrapada. And again, if you recall, Professor Gupta has his fantastic theory of comets. That is, he considers all the descriptions of planets from the Mahabharata text as not really the descriptions of planets, but rather that of comets. Now, that was fine, except he did not do anything after it to test these observations and his claim or his claims for them being comets. So he made his theory as a metaphysical, non-testable theory, and therefore not scientific. Also, in an arbitrary fashion, he considers some of the references as referring to planets and others as not referring to planets. So in that sense, he also termed his theory not only metaphysical but also irrational. Anyways, let's get to the 17th day of the war. For his timeline, that would amount to 2nd November. And we will simply note down that Jupiter and Rohini were in the sky. Again, Professor Gupta has not shown any awareness of this observation of Jupiter from the Karna Parva. And finally, we will look at proposal of Professor Iyengar, N Iyengar. The first day was that of 26th October 1478 BCE. And assuming that was the first day, because I do not have a clarity for the first day of the war, Tithi was Amavasya, Jupiter was near Uttra Bhadrapada, Saturn was near Nakshatra Bharani, and Professor Iyengar interestingly mentions all of these shlok from Mahabharata text where Jupiter observations are mentioned, but then he doesn't go into the details of clearly stating whether the observations were corroborated for his timeline or not. For the 17th day of the war, for his timeline, again assuming 26th October was indeed his proposed first day of the war, 11th November would come out as the 17th day of the war, and we will simply note down that Jupiter and Rohini were up in the sky. Alright, so in summary, we discussed 7 specific proposals of different Mahabharata researchers in the context of astronomy evidence of Jupiter, that is 3 specific observations of Jupiter. Now, although we did not discuss more than 7, I have analyzed many more proposals, and what we observed in these 7 proposals is directionally true for many other proposals that I have analyzed. If we have to summarize it, the thing that comes out distinctly is that majority of Mahabharata researchers, even those who claim that they have employed astronomy evidence to arrive at their proposal, their own proposal for the timing of Mahabharata war, are not aware of the Jupiter reference from the Karna Purva. Now, when it comes to the two other astronomy references of Jupiter from Bhishma Purva, likes of Professor Sengupta simply explains it away by stating that they don't make sense. Now keep in mind, they don't make sense to him, and they did not make sense to his timeline. Likes of Professor Achar or Professor Mohan Gupta propose a wild theory of comets. Now I do not say wild theory in a sense of making a fun of that theory. All revolutionary theories are very irrational and wild in nature. But what makes them rational is a willingness, a desire, insistence of these researchers who propose such theories to test them. And that is where both Professor Achar and Professor Gupta failed miserably. Other Mahabharata researchers show awareness of these two Jupiter astronomy references, but then remain silent of their corroboration or non-corroboration for their own proposal. So in summary, that is the Purva Paksha of all past Mahabharata researchers in the context of all astronomy references of Jupiter from the Mahabharata text.